All right. Continuing on now with our respiratory story, part two. We're going to talk a little bit more about what's going on in the lungs, and then we're going to talk about respiratory volumes as part of this video lecture clip as well. So this is another view from your textbook of a cluster of alveoli, these little tiny air sacs in the lungs. And here you can see some of those pulmonary arterioles that are bringing deoxygenated blood. Remember, the arteries and arterioles in the pulmonary circuit have the deoxygenated blood, and they bring those to these capillary beds that wrap around the alveoli. And that's where your gas exchange is taking place between the air inside these little air sacs and the blood inside those little tiny microscopic blood vessels. So it becomes oxygenated, gives up some of its CO2, and then it flows into these pulmonary venules that are going to lead to the pulmonary veins that are going to take it back to your left atrium. Oops, let me move forward there. Okay, so the walls of each alveolus, that's the singular form of alveoli, those are just one cell thick, and their squamous epithelial cells are very, very thin. Same deal with your capillaries. The walls of a capillary are only one cell thick, squamous epithelial cells. So that's why that setup there works so well for gas exchange. Oxygen gas and carbon dioxide gas can diffuse easily across those very thin walls. And there's really just a little tiny amount of filler space in between the two. Those two walls together are called the respiratory membrane, and it's only 0.5 micrometers thick. A micrometer is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. A meter is a little over 3 feet in size. That's very, 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 very small, very thin. This is kind of a cool picture from your textbook. If you look inside in more detail, what's going on inside these alveoli. So most of the cells are those squamous epithelial cells that form that really, really, really thin wall. And then these little green cells you see here, those are called type 2 surfactant secreting cells. So the walls of these alveoli are so extremely thin, and they're moist. And because of that, there's surface tension. Those moist walls attract each other. Think about like wet Kleenex. If you had a wet piece of Kleenex, what does it want to do? It immediately wants to fold up into a nasty little ball that you're never going to be able to unravel. And same deal with your alveoli. They're very thin like that and moist. So really, they want to fold up on themselves like a wet Kleenex. And they would if it was not for the presence of what are called surfactants that help lubricate the surface in there and help reduce what's called the surface tension within these little alveoli where the walls are trying to attract each other and collapse. In fact, sometimes premature babies are given surfactants artificially in their lungs to help prevent their lungs from collapsing because they aren't making them yet very well. The little purple cells you see in here, those are special types of macrophages that live in the alveoli of your lungs, and hopefully you remember that macrophages do phagocytosis, so they engulf things like bacteria and viruses and dust particles that might wind up down in this part of your respiratory tract. They also ingest your tissues that are damaged, so they're very important. And the alveoli of your lungs, that's a very good place to have macrophages hanging out because you do not want bacteria and viruses, things that can cause infection, down in that part of your, down in those very delicate tissues where you need to do your gas exchange. That's kind of important. Yeah, so here's a representation of the respiratory membrane. Here's the wall of an alveolus. Here's the wall of a capillary with red blood cells in it. And then there's that gas exchange that's taking place. O2 is moving into the blood, CO2 is moving out. A little bit more about the lungs. As you guys know, they occupy most of your thoracic cavity, except for the mediastinum, the portion in the middle between your two lungs. The lungs do have a root And you may have seen that when you did your fetal pig dissections back in Biology 201. But that's where the major blood vessels and then also the bronchi enter into the lungs. And they also have three what are called costal surfaces. The lungs are completely surrounded by your ribs. Costal refers to your ribs. Hopefully you remember that. And so the lungs have anterior, lateral, and posterior costal surfaces. We took a look at this already, the amazing branch work of all of those bronchial passages in your lungs. This is a view from your textbook, a transverse section through both of your lungs. So you've been cut open like this and somebody's looking down on top of your lungs. Here's anterior, here's posterior. And the main reason I'm showing you this view is to highlight for you in light purple here, those are the serous membranes that surround the lungs and line your pleural cavities where your lungs are located. And again, just some review from Biology 201. You've got an outer serous membrane that's called the parietal pleura. And then there is the serous membrane portion that contacts the lungs directly. That's called the visceral pleura. And then there's a little bit of space in between. The space is really kind of exaggerated on this diagram. In fact, sometimes it's called a potential space because it can be there, and other times, like when your lungs are fully inflated, you don't really have a space there. There is some fluid in there, though, and that is your pleural fluid. So keep those in mind because they will come up a little bit more shortly. So we're going to start talking about the mechanics of breathing, how you breathe. And again, pulmonary ventilation, that actually refers to breathing itself. Inhalation, gas is flowing into your lungs. That's also known as inspiration. And expiration, gases are exiting your lungs. All right, so what makes that happen? It's actually due to pressure changes. So gases, like air, flows due to changes in pressure, and it's going to flow from areas where pressure is higher toward areas where pressure is lower. Like if you fill up a balloon and then you squeeze the walls of the balloon, you're increasing the air pressure inside the balloon, so the air is going to flow out of the balloon and back into the atmosphere. Wind is another example. When you experience wind, that's simply air flowing from areas of high atmospheric air pressure to areas of low atmospheric air pressure. Same deal. So breathing actually involves pressure changes within the lungs. As you exhale, your lungs get smaller and compressed. That forces air out of the lungs. And when you inhale, your lungs actually get bigger, they expand, and that reduces the air pressure in the lungs, and that allows air to flow into the lungs. If you're reading along in your textbook goes into a lot more detail about the properties that gases have and what makes them flow and so forth. And I'm going to try to keep it a little bit more simplified than what you have in your textbook, but if you want more detail, it's certainly available there. This is important to know. The pressure within your pleural cavity, so within that potential space there between the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura, that has to be less than the air pressure inside your lungs. That makes sense because if you have a lot of pressure within the pleural cavity, what's it going to do? It's going to compress your lungs and make them collapse. So the lungs are pretty delicate. All those little tiny air sacs in there, there's a lot of airspace in there, and it's pretty easy for your lungs to wind up collapsing under inappropriate conditions. That's what they're showing you here in this diagram from your textbook as well, and they're giving you some of the numbers. Typically, the pressure of the air inside your lungs, so the pressure that's being placed this way within your lungs toward the outside, is 760 millimeters of Hg. Hg stands for mercury, and I'm sure you've seen scales with mercury on the inside that indicate changes in pressure. So there are blood pressure cuffs that are connected to those types of scales where you see the little mercury in the inside move up with increased pressure and move down with decreased pressure. So air pressure is measured that way as well. And don't worry too much about that. Just know that when you see millimeters of mercury, those are the units that are used to describe gas pressures like the atmospheric air pressure. Okay, then the pressure inside the space of your pleural cavity has to be a little bit lower than that. So that helps keep your lungs inflated because the air in there is pushing outward. The pressure on within the pleural cavity is pushing back, but not pushing back enough to make your lungs collapse. What happens though when that pressure inside your pleural cavity does increase above the pressure of the air inside your lungs? That's when you have a collapsed lung, and the clinical term for that is atelectasis. Say that really fast, about 10 times. Atelectasis, atelectasis. That's pretty difficult. That's lung collapse. Now you may have heard before of somebody having a wound that punctures the walls of the pleural cavity, and that actually allows air to get into that little thin area of space between the visceral and parietal pleura. And when that happens, you have air rushing in there. It increases the pressure within that space surrounding the lungs, and it increases over the pressure inside the lungs, and that makes your lung collapse. And there's an image of a collapsed lung. So you can see when you squeeze out the air that's inside the lungs can compress down to these little wimpy structures like that that are not useful for gas exchange. Plugged bronchioles can also cause collapse of alveoli as well. So if you have blockages in those little tiniest air passages that are leading to alveoli, those can cause collapse. All right, so what happens during inspiration and expiration? So inhaling and exhaling, what's actually going on? And some of this you've heard before when you studied the muscular system in Biology 201. Okay, first of all, inhalation is an active process, which means you have muscles contracting to make that happen in this case. So if you look over here on this diagram, you guys know that your diaphragm is your primary muscle for breathing. And when it's in a relaxed state, it has a curved shape like this. It really looks like a parachute when it's in a relaxed state. So it forms a dome upward like that on the inferior surfaces of your lungs. So that's when the diaphragm is relaxed. And what do you notice about the space, the amount of space that's available within your thoracic cavity? It's at its lowest when the diaphragm is relaxed like that. So the volume of your lungs is lower. They're being compressed. When you inhale, the diaphragm contracts, and when it contracts, it actually flattens out like that. So you might be tempted to think that when the diaphragm contracts, it moves upward like that, but that's not the case. It flattens out. And when that happens, now think about it. Now your lungs have more room to expand. Okay, and they actually get dragged open because they are connected to the other tissues here that are lining the thoracic cavity. And so your lungs get pulled outward like this. They get bigger. Now what's happening to the pressure inside the lungs? The air pressure, when they get bigger, goes down. Okay, and it winds up dropping lower than the atmospheric air pressure. That makes air flow down into the lungs. That's when you have an inhale. You've also got those intercostal muscles, the muscles between your ribs. They contract as well, and they help expand, lengthen your rib cage as well. That also helps increase the size of your thoracic cavity so that you can inhale air. So it's all about the pressure. Expiration or exhalation, that occurs when your diaphragm and those intercostal muscles relax. So the space inside the lungs gets much smaller. The lungs get compressed. So the pressure in there, just like if you were squeezing on a balloon, goes up, and that makes the air flow out. That's when you have an exhalation. So muscles have to contract to make you inhale, and as they relax, that forces the air back out of your lungs during an exhale. Okay, what can influence pulmonary ventilation, your ability to breathe? So those muscles that you have to contract in order to make you breathe, there are three things that they have to be able to overcome to make sure that you're able to take in air properly and allow it to flow back out. One of those is airway resistance. That makes sense if you have anything in your respiratory air passages, those bronchial tubes in any location, that's blocking airflow. Yeah, it's going to be more difficult for you to get air down into your lungs. It's also going to be more difficult for you to get it back out, which is also not good. You're not getting the carbon dioxide rich air back out of your lungs. That alveolar surface tension that we've already talked about. And then lung compliance. What is lung compliance? If you think about it, your lungs have to be very, very elastic organs, and they do have elastic connective tissue in the spaces between those alveoli. So when they inflate, they've got to be able to rebound back to a smaller size to help you exhale. So they've got to be very elastic, and lung compliance refers to that. How elastic are your lungs? How easily are they able to change size and shape so that you can breathe properly? Okay, what causes airflow resistance? When this happens, obviously your breathing is going to become more strenuous, more difficult. Anything that's obstructing bronchioles or even the larger bronchial tubes, your bronchi, will interfere with your breathing. So that just makes sense. But even something like asthma, when you have an asthma attack, that's due to a severe allergy, an allergic reaction that you have to something. And allergies cause bronchial passages to constrict. And so that's going to increase airway resistance, and you're not going to be able to breathe easily. Epinephrine, the neurotransmitter and hormone epinephrine, has the opposite effect. It actually dilates bronchioles, those little small air tubes, and helps reduce that air resistance. That's why when people are having an asthma attack, or if they have an severe allergic reaction to something that's interfering with their breathing, they'll inject themselves using an EpiPen to deliver epinephrine and redilate those bronchioles. Alveolar surface tension. So I've already talked about the surfactant. It really is kind of like your own personal detergent that you're producing within the alveoli of your lungs, because that's what detergents actually do. One of the things that they do when you're washing the dishes, they help reduce surface tension so that you can scrub things off of your dirty dishes. And so we've talked about that already. If you have in premature infants, when they're born, they don't produce these surfactants very well, and so it makes their lungs, the alveoli in their lungs, much more prone to collapsing. So here's a little diagram of normal alveoli and alveoli that are collapsing due to a lack of surfactant. Lung compliance, as I mentioned, that's a measure of the change in blood volume. See, I'm used to talking about cardiovascular. You guys will have to alert me if I say anything else stupid during any of these video lectures. I'm a little bit brain fried today. I've got a whole bunch of video lectures to do. Lung compliance is a measure of change in lung volume that occurs during good old-fashioned breathing. And again, it's due to the expandability of your lungs. So what would decrease that? One of the things is lifelong smoking. That damages those elastic tissues in your lungs, and they get replaced with scar tissue that's not able to rebound as easily. And so you can't change the volumes, the sizes of your lungs as easily when that happens. So that reduces your lung compliance. Or if you think about sometimes burn victims, if you have a burn along the skin, surrounding your thoracic cavity, and that gets replaced with scar tissue that doesn't allow your skin to stretch and rebound as easily. That can interfere with the ability of you to increase the size of your thoracic cavity when you're breathing, and that's going to interfere with your lung compliance as well. So it's not always about things that have gone wrong inside the lungs. Even having less surfactant will change your lung compliance as well. All right, I think I'm actually going to cut this video clip up here and do a separate video clip on the different types of respiratory volumes, because it'll take us a few minutes to discuss those.